Okay, so this is the second of what will only be two mini lectures on law and society. The remainder of what we cover this week is going to be through readings, exercises, and a small group assignment. So let's jump in. Some of these slides will be familiar, like this one. So if you'll recall, we discussed the way in which the landscape has impacted the formation of religion in the region, in particular the deification of water and the source of life, and that led to a form of religious practice in which the mother goddess was at the top of the deity hierarchy, if you will. She's the origin of everything, and she is the primordial goddess in ancient Sumerian, but also many Mesopotamian cultures moving forward. However, if you recall from when we were discussing this in the previous mini lecture, that was not universal and it didn't last forever. So let's get into that a little bit. Goddess worship. In Sumer, that was Inanna. She was the foremost Sumerian deity and the patron of Uruk, which is the earliest large city in the region. And then later, when the Akkadian Empire arose and spread its culture throughout the region, they did identify the goddess Inanna with Ishtar, their own primordial mother goddess. And this was largely successful, primarily due to the work of the high priestess of the Akkadian Empire, Enkidu. The point of enlisting her in this project from the emperor Sargon was literally to try and stabilize the empire as it took over territory that had cultural differences from Akkad. So this brings us back to this slide from the previous mini lecture, in which this origin myth of or this creation myth of Sumer tells us about not only the mother goddess and the power of the mother goddess and the power of the woman's body and the identification with water, but also the sacredness of sex. So this would have been the mythology and the religion that applied to these early pre-city state Mesopotamian cultures. And this is really important because as we go through the stages of Politicomorphism, there's going to be a parallel set of changes, and that has to do not only with social class, but also with gender roles. So right now we have a primordial mother goddess from which all life springs, and then that starts to change over time. Accompanying the worship of the primordial mother goddess is also the sacredness of sex. Now, I do want to point out that there are ecstatic traditions in every religion, including Christianity. You should read some medieval mysticism if you are not convinced. Ecstasy is literally the experience of joy so great that you leave the body. Ecstasis is the Greek origins of that word. And it's not uncommon for sacred sex to be at the core of religions, especially when those religions are rooted in the practices of life and procreation. So the closer that a culture is to the precarity of life in the natural world, the more likely they will have a sacred version of sex. My favorite quote on this is from Gwendolyn Like. She says, "In ancient Near Eastern thought, religion permeated all aspects of life." So this includes sexual desire, but sexual desire is actually at the center of this. Sexual desire was considered a divine force that ensured the continuity of generations, of gods, of humans, and of all other animate beings. When you think about it, sex, before the intervention of modern medicine and family planning practices, is a route to procreation. which means it is a route to life. So it's not only an experience of ecstasy, but it is also an experience of the creation of life, which is a divine thing in many cultures. The fact that life comes from seemingly nothing. It's not a mechanical process in the way that we often think of it in Western medicalized traditions. And instead, there's a lot of wonder involved in the process. To go along with that, sex is celebrated as a sacred act, including with temple prostitutes. So there are temple prostitutes of all three genders. It's common and honored. So you notice I said three genders. So in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a third gender, and this seems to have extended all the way up through at least the Akkadian Empire. This is actually an Assyrian royal attendant who is deemed to be a third gender. So a little bit later, there are not a lot of artworks from the most ancient period. So we'll have to make do. These members of the third gender were devotees of Ishtar or Inanna, and they had a number of names that I will probably murder, so I won't bother. And they're representatives of an ambiguous gender. So it's not that they are all effeminate men or masculine women or hermaphrodites. They are somewhere in between. And they have different roles. Many of them are considered sacred, and this includes cross-dressing, ritual dance, healing, prophecy, and lament. So for the grieving process, these people played a special role. And it doesn't always matter what their genital arrangements are, we'll put it that way. Sometimes they're castrated, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are involved in sexual acts with men, and sometimes they're not. Their role is permanently third gender, or non-gender might be a more accurate description, and that actually derives from the mythological explanation of their existence. So in the mythology in which they spring forth, they actually are not assigned a reproductive role and therefore are outside of the binary logic of reproduction. This role was institutionalized because they, quote, existed between myth and reality and embodied the divine otherness. So their lack of identification with a typical sexualized gender is what made them divine, because they could not be collapsed down into a human category. So this is an important part of the sacred roles of gender in ancient Mesopotamia. It's also important for us to remember that our distinctions of what gender is and what it looks like are not going to apply to all of the cultures that we study. So we want to be careful not to be practicing presentism and assuming that masculinity and femininity, gender, and even sexuality look the same in other cultures, especially pre-modern cultures, as they do to us today. So let's talk a little bit about homosexuality. There is an issue with terminology, especially using modern terminology to describe pre-modern cultures. Homosexuals are not a thing. The idea that a person's identity can be rooted in their sexual preferences or even behaviors is a thoroughly modern, thoroughly late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon. And if you're interested in that, I highly recommend Foucault and his History of Sexuality, although he is wrong about the Middle Ages, but we'll forgive him that because he's mostly right. Homosexuality refers to same-sex desire, whether it is acted upon or not. Homoeroticism is in the same vein, but it refers primarily to desire and less to acts. So in ancient Mesopotamia, homosexuality is not acknowledged between women at all, like not a thing, but it is common between men with certain social protocols. And yet, it's important for us to acknowledge that the practice of same-sex acts was not always about desire, right? So we can call it homosexuality, but that implies a certain level of desire. Same with homoeroticism. But the actions themselves are not always about desire or eroticism. So here's a great example of male same-sex behavior that comes from the Suma Alu, which is a book of 10,000 omens. And what I like about this is that it's not super clear that men having sex with men is super okay, or men having sex with men is super not okay. What you'll see if we look at this in more detail is a couple of clear distinctions. So there are 5 of these omens that pertain to male sexual behavior. The first one, it says, if a man copulates with his equal from the rear, he becomes the leader among his peers and brothers. Okay, fine. If a man yearns to express his manhood while in prison, and thus, like a male cult prostitute, mating with men becomes his desire, he will experience evil. So if he ends up participating in sex like a male cult prostitute, but he isn't one, then bad things happen to him. If a man copulates with a male cult prostitute, though, trouble will leave him. So having sex with male cult prostitutes is not a bad thing. Having sex like a male cult prostitute when you aren't one apparently is, but having sex with one is apparently good for you. If a man copulates with a male courtier or a royal attendant, worry will possess him for a whole year, but will then leave him. So that's kind of a mixed bag there. If a man copulates with a houseborn slave, a hard destiny will befall him. So what we're actually seeing here is that the rules governing same-sex behavior by men are actually the same as those governing sexual hierarchy between the sexes, but the difference here is not in the gender of the partner, but the specifics of the act, we'll put it that way, right? To be penetrated is to be passive and even feminized, which is why if a non-male cult prostitute has sex like a male cult prostitute, that apparently means if he allows himself to be penetrated, right, then he has become passive and feminized. And in a very, very macho culture, as Mesopotamia was, this is like the ultimate shame. To penetrate and to be active is to also act out one's vigor and masculinity. And so to do that with another person, if they are your equal or in the realm of your social sphere, that is something that will bring you auspicious omens. It's obviously not common, however, because if it were common, then it wouldn't be so auspicious. Right, where were we? If a man copulates with a houseborn slave, a hard destiny will befall him. And this one matters because this one is rape. The difference in authority is what's key here, because this is someone taking advantage of someone who is below their station and unable to escape the situation, unable to consent, essentially. So Nisennin, who is the scholar that I have been using for this material, Nisennin points out that the Mesopotamian interpretation of gender, social space, and sexual hierarchy is male-dominated. It's very, very patriarchal. In it, sexual contact benefited the active and penetrative party, not the passive one. So this brings us back around to women. We do want to take a moment. Hang on. Yeah, that's what I thought. we want to, we can start here. But the point here is to pause and ask ourselves why we have only talked about male sexual desire, and also why female sexual desire is pretty much impossible to find in either the literature or the artwork of ancient Mesopotamia. And if you can find something and prove me wrong, bonus points, because I totally want to include something like that. But the key thing is that if women are always considered to be the passive partner because a heteronormative idea of sex assumes that penetration is the only valid form of sexual action, then women somehow are incapable of having sex with each other, or at least according to a patriarchal point of view. The key point is that female desire is much harder to pin down and to locate in historical texts, particularly within patriarchal societies for whom it essentially doesn't exist. which is not to say that there was no female-female desire or relationships. That is not likely to be the case at all. But it is to say that it was essentially invisible to the people who had the capacity to record cultural values. So, now we left off our discussion of male-male homosexual behavior and desire, I guess. No, male-male homosexual acts. With the assertion that the important thing here is really about who penetrates and who is penetrated, and that male desire is not really, or maybe not always, about desire. And yet the Epic of Gilgamesh, which BT dubs, is the oldest written work of literature that we know of, and it is the second oldest religious text. The eponymous Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and he's described as extraordinarily handsome as well as a demigod. And he's so handsome and powerful that he's distressing to the gods because they all want to have sex with him, and he has this crazy sexual appetite. So they create a companion for him so that he doesn't destroy everything in the process. And this companion is Enkidu, who is a wild, hairy man, so the original bear, with long tresses like those of a woman. And Enkidu in the wilderness is literally animalistic, and he is tamed by a prostitute who comes to lay with him and basically turn him into a man. So that's a thing. And then while this is going on, Gilgamesh has some dreams of a falling star and an axe. And then he feels very attracted to the axe. It's very weird. And his mom says, oh, that's fine. You're going to have a big friend, and you're going to love him like a wife and caress and embrace him. So interesting. Gilgamesh is our king, our legendary masculine hero king of ancient Sumer. Yes, sorry, took me a second. Of ancient Sumer. And he is going to be putting himself in the passive position. And yes, it does get pretty explicit. I mean, it's not like pornographic, but it's also not, hey, you have to read between the lines. So when they do finally meet, at first they're fighting each other, and then all that sexual tension bursts and they kiss each other and form a bond, right? And they go hand in hand on their adventures. Lots of adventures. Eventually, the goddess Ishtar, she lusts after Gilgamesh and propositions him and says, hey, be my bridegroom. And he says no, which she is not pleased with at all, which leads to her sending down the bowl of heaven that Enkidu essentially makes it possible for Gilgamesh to kill. There is a lot of phallic imagery in there with the stabbing and the partnering and the, I don't know, it's some kind of like interspecies threesome, but I'm going to let that go. But now the gods are angry that the bull of heaven has been killed, so they kill off Enkidu. And when they do, Gilgamesh is beside himself with grief. He covers the face of his friend like a bride, tears out his hair in clumps, rips off his clothes, and mourns inconsolably over the loss of his friend. And after that, he even swears off of sex. He basically becomes an ascetic, or he practices a masculine form of asceticism in which he no longer has sex at all because Enkidu is dead. So we can say that this was not common, and that might be true. And we can say that this was not necessarily about desire, or it was not always about desire, and that might be true. But we can also see that sometimes it was. Sometimes it was. So we'll leave Gilgamesh and Enkidu to talk a little bit more about the poem itself, which is quite old. So the oldest bits of the poem that we have are from a scattered collection of cuneiform tablets written in Sumerian, and they're from about 2100 BCE. And then there's another one in Old Babylonian, and they're from about 1800 BCE. So both quite old, but the earliest ones are really just a collection of different poems about the same guy. They're not woven together like an epic, but the Old Babylonian ones are. And then later, the standard Babylonian version, which I think is also called the Akkadian version because of the actual linguistics of the situation, but I'm not going to get into that. The standard Babylonian version is much later, almost 1,000 years maybe, And that one is definitely an epic, and it's the one that we have the most preserved from. Although, if you do read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you will notice that it is very disjointed in some places, and that's just because the clay tablets are missing. So we jump from one place to another really quickly. This is likely based on a real person who really was a king and who really did rule the city of Uruk in the early dynastic period. So that was not quite 1,000 years before our earliest written copies of the poem, but quite a long way in the past. And over the centuries, increasingly fabulous tales of his exploits, they kind of accreted like sand in a oyster becomes a pearl, right? They just kind of coalesce around the legendary figure, and he becomes semi-divine, and voila, now we have this new political and religious moment in which the great men of the past can enter into the pantheon, and that reinforces this movement towards monolatry, really. But back up just another second. Before we get into all the dudes and all the sex, well, all of their sex, don't forget that with the mother goddess, with the mother goddess also comes a very different relationship to women. So we're going to talk a little bit about the gender roles of later Mesopotamia. But before we do that, it is worth going back and noting that in the earliest forms of ancient Mesopotamia, women actually had it pretty good. They were not equals. Let's be clear. They were still very well controlled, and they were still given in marriage contracts. They didn't have a ton of agency, but they were allowed to own property, and they were allowed to seek a divorce, and upon divorce to retain their property. And that is an important point, and it is directly linked to goddess worship and the importance of the female divine in the daily life and the sacred rituals of the people. As we go forward and we go from the pre-city cultures, we build our temples, and then we have all of this masculine desire, all of this masculinity here. And then we get to Henotheism, which is the king of the gods situation. And that is what characterizes the Ubaid period of settlement. So as we start to see city-states coalesce, we see the gods develop kings. And in particular, different city-states will have different patron deities, which will lead us into fully fledged cities and civilization proper, as well as monolatry, as we discussed in the previous mini lecture. But the key thing here is that between the moment of goddess worship and women having comparatively generous rights and the emergence of empire and monolatry in its proper form, we have the slow and systematic loss of rights for women. And it is worth asking why these changes in political life, political organization, and social structure are linked to these changes in religion, are linked to these changes in gender roles and rights. So empire, there's a lot of empires. We're only going to kind of discuss 3, but the first empire to really spread across most of Mesopotamia is the Akkadian Empire. And this is quite a ways back. But then after it falls, you get a partial empire, which is the old Assyrian Empire, which you can see really only pertains to the upper Mesopotamia. And then it's Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire, a little bit later on, that manages to kind of conquer that same amount of territory and then some a little bit. Now, on this map, I am going to pause to note that if anybody thought that the quote from I think it's the like text about how the interpretation of the mother goddess and the riverbed as her genitals. If anybody thought that that was far-fetched, I'd like for you to have a good hard look at this map of the Mesopotamian river valleys, particularly the Euphrates. So it's not hard to understand why it is not hard to understand that women and their power to produce life are linked to water and the river and the earth, right? The river valley is literally the marriage of river and earth, and that is also what brings forth life. So it's not hard to see how those things end up linked. But it is really important to understand that as the idea of being able to own the land comes to solidify, so too does the idea of being able to be... Try that again. As the idea of being able to own the land solidifies, so too does the idea of being able to own a woman's body. Patriarchy is about property. This is key here. Sex and passionate love have nothing to do with marriage. It does not matter what gender of people you're into. What you do with your passionate love has absolutely nothing to do with what happens in marriage. Totally separate things. Marriage is a legal contract, and it is about property rights. So in later Mesopotamian culture, it is not uncommon for wealthy men to have not only a wife, but multiple concubines. And even the concubines are in a hierarchy. So when the chief wife dies, each concubine moves up a rank. So the chief concubine, I guess, the head concubine, I don't know. She gets promoted to chief wife, and then everybody else gets to go up a rank, and he may add a new concubine or wife to the hierarchy at the bottom. But the key thing about this is to remember that marriage and reproduction is primarily about property. The policing of women's bodies and knowing, excuse me, how do I want to put this? The policing of women's bodies is primarily about property and inheritance rights. So I want you to pause and take a second to think about this. And I'm going to leave some time in this video for you to ponder. Why? Why is this a thing? Why? And it's good to ask yourself this question. And I hope that you thought about some possible answers. The answer that seems important to me, but is not necessarily the only answer, is that if you do not have to worry about the inheritance of property as a man, right? As a man, if you, as a property owning man in a patriarchal society, if you don't have to worry about your sons inheriting property, then you don't have to worry that your sons are definitely yours. And that becomes the key thing here. The policing of women's bodies and women's sexuality is really about guaranteeing that those who inherit your property are in fact your heirs, right? They are from your bloodline. And if you don't know where your wife has been or who she's been with, then you don't actually know that all of the stuff that you've accumulated and you are leaving behind you in a property-based system, you don't know that it's actually going to your heirs. It might just be some giant con where your wife is actually trying to, I don't know, con you out of property after death. I don't know. I'm not really sure of the logic on that one. The key point here, though, is that the controlling of women and their bodies is about property inheritance rights.